Hello, and welcome back to Power Rewired. I'm Catarina von Maydell.
And I'm Liza Collins.
Very good to see you again, Liza.
Great to see you too, Kat.
You kind of had to say that, didn't you?
Today?
That was an example of power. I forced you to say something nice. So we're talking about fear today and what the purpose of it is. And I think this sort of has come up in conversations that we've been having with clients and other people, is that a lot of people are feeling quite fearful for a range of different reasons. And one question I sort of implicitly get all the time is, why do we still have to deal with fear in a modern era? And my response is because it's a natural biological process and it has a lot of information. What's your reason that you want to talk about fear?
So I'm really interested in the conversation around fear, and I've been having some really interesting conversations over the last couple of months about this. And agree, fear from a biological perspective is it's there to keep us safe. That's the purpose. The value is that it keeps us alive. There's a threat in the environment, our body reacts, and we're able to either fight or flight, or the fall or the freeze. So there's value in fear. What I'm starting to really enjoy the more I get into this is seeing the safety part of it. Really understanding our biology and not necessarily using the word like hack, how can we hack our biology? I think it's more about just understanding it, understanding what's our typical threat response, what's our go-to. So, for example, if I think about my work environment and leadership, quite often I'll be saying to people, well, what is your natural go-to? When I look at mine, I've always thought mine's fight. Right, there's a bit of Welshness coming out. Mine's got a fight response, and I know I do lean heavily to fight, but I also know, and I don't often admit this, there's also the fawning, and sometimes if I can't get out of that, there's freeze. So I think there's value in understanding who we are when we're in our threat response, who shows up the most, and just accepting that. And that could be also part of our conditioning, how we've grown up, and how we were modeled the behavior around fear. And then thinking about, what's the value in that in terms of leadership in the workspace? So I think understanding our own response, understanding then as, bless you,
Thank you.
how we show up as external nervous systems for others. And that really excites me when I think about that conversation, because I think it's an aspect of fear that we don't often think about. And I guess when I think back to parenting my children, I've naturally had to adapt my nervous system to regulate myself, to then regulate them. And I think that's something that we can think about doing in the workplace. And then just thinking about, what are the key signals? What's the fear telling us? Because I think there are messages within it that once we're regulated, we can see what they are, and that helps us to navigate. So I think there's a lot to unpack within fear. And I'm excited. I'm excited to have these conversations, because for me, it keeps coming back to safety, and we can explore more of that and what that means in different ways. But yeah, that's how it's been showing up for me. What about you, Kat?
I love that you talked about the threat response. So when we experience fear, different people will respond to fear in different ways, and different people will respond differently in different contexts. So generally the 4 responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So fight is what you and I have, our natural response. I'm not Welsh, but it is very natural for me. And it's basically, come on, I'm ready, right?
Exactly.
And I've never gotten into a physical fight. I have no intention of getting in a physical fight, but I do not back down.
Yeah.
A lot of people also go into flight, which is run away or find some way to shut down. If they completely shut down, that's the freeze response, where they just kind of like panic. And that's a very natural and healthy response. All of these responses are actually really biologically and evolutionarily really important and really valuable.
Yeah.
There's a reason we have them. It's because evolutionarily we survived because of them. And
Yeah.
the fawn response, that's actually a new definition that's been added, which is kind of sucking up to the people who are bullying you. And that's actually bullying you, threatening you, whatever.
Yeah.
And that's been added fairly recently because that's actually a modern evolution.
Mm.
Um, while sort of out in the wild, you're not going to turn to the bear that's about to attack you and say, "Oh, look how strong your teeth are." You know, it's,
Exactly. How big your muscles are.
yeah. Ooh, big
How
bear.
shiny your fur is.
So what's interesting is you and I, from what you've told me, I think you and I are very similar where we have a lot of very natural, we're just going to respond with fight. But there's
Yeah.
a lot of stories that you've told me about where I would have responded with a fight response and you actually responded in very different ways in other contexts of your life. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was more functional or it made more sense at the time or it suited what your body felt was the right thing to do. So these are not cognitive decisions, these are biological decisions.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sort of triggered this conversation for us was we were thinking about all the different things that people can be or are fearful of in today's world. And some of these things are very, very individual in the moment, you know, like bullying or toxic situations in a work setting or domestic setting. But there could be other things like things that are happening in our communities. So they're outside of our immediate, and our community members will also be feeling that fear. So there's sort of a collective fear.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's sort of larger fears, and I want to try and stay away from politics, but there's larger fears like climate calamities. And most of us would just call it the climate crisis. Some people don't, but there's a lot of climate calamities that are happening. There's increasing wars happening. There's economic instability, which is not necessarily showing clearly, but there's very strong indicators that we in the Western world are on the path to a recession. But it's actually many bigger existential fears that we're facing. And some people will not even be aware of it. There's nothing to fight against. And so a lot of people seem to be going into a freeze response.
Yeah.
Or a flight response. Flight response would be different types of addictions, you know, I'm going to call it drug abuse because it's not just sort of a recreational, oh, I want to have a fun night tonight. It's, you know, the chronic use of drugs, alcohol, food, whatever other vices people have. You know, so people are basically, when you have these big existential fears, the responses will be quite different than if it's somebody attacking you personally in the moment.
Yeah. I just wanted to add two things to that. So interestingly, you're right about the fawn response. And I've noticed, so for me, if I fawn, it's most likely going to be in the work environment. And there's reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons for that are you're in an environment where somebody has power over you. You know, you're there for your livelihood. So you have to, because of the situation that you're in, you're there because of your livelihood, that you have to sometimes get on with some of those people and you have to people please and you have to, you know, and then that's where I noticed that would come out in me. And it doesn't feel like a very brave thing to admit, you know, if I normally come from that fight response. But I also have to be honest and recognize when I've been in those situations, and at times, if my husband's been at home looking after the kids, I'm an earner for 4 people. And I can't just tell my boss to F you and walk out, however much I'd like to. So, you know, that's when I've noticed the fawn response coming out. And I just wanted to mention something as well about the addictions. So there is a really great illustration. I think it's Stephen Porges that's written it, and it shows the curve that goes from our typical kind of like, you know, the response that we should be in when we're in a regulated nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes up at this curve, and you go up into the first section then of fight or flight. So you see you see a threat, your body naturally goes into fight or flight. We're not conscious of this, it happens, we're hijacked in the moment. If you can't fight or run away, then there's an aspect then that goes into fawn. And if you can't get out of the fawn, you go into freeze. So when you go into freeze, so interestingly, biologically, when an animal, and I always think, we talk about lions and tigers and whatever, but I think just simply cats, when the cat's out, they're catching the mouse. The mouse can't escape. They can't people please the cat, What shampoo do you use to make your coat look amazing? The hormones will flood their system to make them disassociate, that when they're killed, it doesn't hurt so much. So they're disassociated from the pain, and the hormone flood that goes through the body at that point closes everything down. And there's some interesting research to show how people who have mental health conditions where they're disassociated is linked to that part of the threat response, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So the bit about addiction that I wanted to mention that I learned in the last year from working with some fantastic clinical psychologists is that when we get trapped in the freeze response at the top, that's when we go to our addictions. Because we can't get back to regulate, we use the addiction to flip us back into the regulated state. So if I think about chocolate, I'm stressed, I have to do a piece of work by a certain deadline, I'll go grab a bit of dark chocolate, and my system feels like it regulates, and I kind of go back to that regulated response. But when you think about some of the heavier addictions that people are working with and using, it's self-medication because they can't flip themselves out of freeze. So they get to the top, they're stuck in freeze, they use the addiction to try to flip them back into normality, and then they end up going back. So that's the cycle of addiction that I've been starting to understand over the last year from working with these psychologists that look at mental health and addiction as almost like through the lens of like the social determinants of mental health and how regulated we are in our nervous system, rather than there being a chemical imbalance. I don't want to take this down like a whole mental health root story, because I think we both know we've got so much to say on this, but that's what I'm finding really fascinating. And some of these things just feel like they're really simple. These things are really, really simple for us as human beings. And because they're simple, then to me, they feel like a roadmap at the moment with all the chaos that's going on and the uncertainty. I'm using this as a roadmap to keep me regulated as I'm navigating through the chaos that I'm seeing that's kind of unfolding around us at the moment.
So first off, chocolate is not an addiction. Chocolate is a separate food group.
It's a multivitamin.
There we go. Vitamin C. What's standing out to me is I think what a lot of people don't think about when they think about their fear or other people's responses to fear, because we very rarely connect people's actions to the fear triggers that got them to that point. Yeah. So here in Ontario, Canada, there's a really big push by our provincial government to get rid of all the safe injection sites. And there's a huge discussion around forced, I can't even remember the words because I'm so angry about it, forced rehab, like forcing people into rehab, when there's lots of people who want to go into voluntary rehab and have zero access to it, right? So there's so many discussions around treating addiction through force rather than recognizing that actually is going to make, in a lot of cases, the addictions worse, because it's kind of exacerbating what the root cause of a lot of addictions are. So we're not really understanding the progress of fear to threat response to functional or dysfunctional responses to the impacts of those things. So there's this chronology that, because it plays out often over longer periods of time, we're not really thinking about the whole spectrum, the chronology spectrum, the time spectrum. Yeah. And what's interesting is there was a post I saw on LinkedIn yesterday that I responded to where somebody from the advertising world was saying, we used to market through sex, sexy women, blah, 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 right? Yeah. And now we're marketing to rage. And my response on that was, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where the world was getting better for most people, not for everybody, but for most people in the Western world. And everybody was aspirational, and this American dream concept in many countries was alive and well. And of course, then marketing through sex or sexual content or sexual innuendo or whatever was effective because everybody was kind of aspiring. But in the last decade or more, as people get more fearful for their futures, first it was economic futures, and now it's for, sort of the full spectrum future. When people are really scared, they go into a rage response eventually, and they might externalize that rage, they might internalize that. There's some gender differences around that. Generally, men tend to externalize their rage and women tend to internalize it. Not to say that all women and men are the same. But as we get into this world where people are genuinely scared about immediate things in their life and bigger trends, and of course, then we need scapegoats. So marketing through rage works way more effectively than marketing through sort of aspirational stuff, because most people don't believe their lives are actually going to get better. And what I find interesting is that sort of going across sociodemographics, and very few people seem to be really consciously aware of it, but intuitively they seem to be, right? So therefore, we're going more into rage. We've got more addictions. We've got more homelessness because of all the cycles of these addictions and fear and anger and societal breakdown and everything else, yeah? So what I think we need to do is really refocus on the sources of fear. And there's another piece I want to bring in to that, rather than focusing on the outcomes of fear. Like, rage is the product of lots of things happening to get people to rage. So yes, we need to be aware of rage because it's a very destructive force. But in order to do anything about it, we have to look at the precursors to it.
Yeah.
And here's another piece that you and I talk about when just you and I are talking, is how people come in with their histories, and what might make you scared or not scared in a certain situation may not make me scared, or it does make me scared. We can have quite opposite reactions because of our history, right?
Yeah.
And both you and I have had periods in our lives where we have been dissociative, not necessarily in a clinical sense, but in terms of really not being in touch with our own emotions. And therefore, we may not even react to what other people would be scared about. Or because we have more experience with something or a better way of processing and understanding the circumstance, we may not necessarily be as scared as other people because they don't know how to process that information or what to do with it. Yeah. So we even need to look not just at the response of fear, but all of the precursors to it, including to our histories, and how are we even showing up, and what does that mean, how we process any fear triggers that we might be exposed to.
Yeah. And as you were speaking then, something really interesting popped into my head. So if you think about from the advertising perspective, so when sex was being the main sort of message through advertising, you think biologically, we're only going to think about sex when we feel safe. So in terms of our survival, if we feel safe, we know where the food's coming from, then we've got time for recreation, we've got time for sex. And I guess, again, it's just so simple, isn't it? So the marketing message to get to humans at that time, which when society felt relatively safe, of course, there's been different conflicts and stuff that have been happening over the last sort of like 30, 40 years. But on the whole, if the population was feeling safe and regulated, then sex would appeal to them. Whereas now, if people are feeling unsafe, then the advertising executives are probably realizing sex ain't going to make it, because people aren't in the safe zone to even think about sex. They're in the survival zone. And actually, when you're in survival, some clever psychologist has probably worked out what will appeal to people is maybe the divide, the rage, and how can you leverage fear. So what I'm finding really interesting about this conversation is this is just uncovering just some of the information, isn't it, that sits underneath fear, and how we can work with it. So rather than feel trapped and disempowered, how can we empower ourselves and actually know what's going on and understand, but just make things transparent, and therefore we've got more choices. Because also, I remember somebody saying years ago, the acronym for fear if you think about this, false evidence appearing real. And I suppose there's an element of fear that we're either fearful of the past or the future. Because I suppose if we're in the present moment, what that looks like is going to be dysregulation. If we think about present moment, if we're fearful, we're dysregulated. But then in our head, if we're ruminating about fear, that could be more about fearful of the future. So I think when I'm in fear, I can feel in the moment if I'm dysregulated. But when I really tap into that fear, it's like, what if the job's not there? What if my children aren't safe? You know, what if my house gets taken? You know, it's that future false evidence appearing real. Yeah, so I just want to share that. So had you come across that acronym before, and how would you kind of relate to that?
So I have to go back to the marketing sex, and I think we need to rebrand our podcast from Power Rewired, which is basically about creating, like, how do we manage our own power so that we can create more safety for ourselves. Maybe we need to call it Have More Sex.
Yeah.
Because that's really kind of the goal, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. We'll get more viewers that way. I'll probably stop on YouTube.
You know, the acronym of fear that false evidence appearing real, in this situation, I think there is a lot to be scared about.
Yeah.
I think in this case, it's not actually false evidence, but what I think is important is we need to investigate more. So when people are going into freeze state and they're kind of really incapacitated, or flight state, if you're a mouse caught by a cat, I definitely want to go into freeze. Like, yeah, please give me that. But if there's a chance of survival, if there's a chance of moving forward, then we have to understand our threat better. So it's not so much that it's false evidence. It's more that it's misunderstood evidence. Obviously, that doesn't fit the acronym. But we need to inquire, is this false, or am I actually understanding the circumstance correctly? And if I understand it correctly, what can I do about it? Because what our competencies are, what we're actually able to do, will determine how we assess a threat. Yeah. So if I'm on crutches and I see a bear come along, and me flattering him and telling him he's wonderful doesn't stop the attack, I can't run, right?
Yeah.
So if I don't have the capacity to deal with the threat, then my response is going to be very different. But if I do have the capacity to respond, I'll actually assess the threat in a very different way. This is a little bit off topic, but I think it's really relevant. There's quite a bit of research, not quite a bit, there's some research that looks at entrepreneurs and asks, are they more risk tolerant? Do they have a higher capacity for fear? Is sort of the implied piece to that. And the answer is pretty consistently no, but they're better at assessing the risks. So it basically means that they can assess the risk, and if they don't have the competencies to deal with it, they have sort of that self-efficacy, the belief that they can develop the competencies in enough time to respond to those threats or those opportunities.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as well, even if you go back to the analogy of the person that could be in a wheelchair with the bear coming, if you assess the threats correctly, then you're less likely to put yourself in that situation where you're in a wheelchair outside with the bear coming. I suppose that's the message that I'm hearing from what you're saying, in terms of if you have the overlay of the entrepreneurial mindset, or use that as a lens that we can look through in life, then how do we minimize the exposure to some of those threats? And that's kind of what it feels like we need to be at the moment, more than I've ever realized before. So I'm just thinking, because obviously we want this podcast to be helpful and share some insights. What's your so what? So we have this information. What's your kind of key message for the so what?
Accept that fear is part of our biology and is designed to give us information. It's not always accurate information, because we've got historical screens that influence our sense of fear. what we're able to do and able to understand will influence how we respond to the fear or even how we assess the fear. But if there's an immediate threat, act on it, full stop, right? But most of the fears that we're talking about are kind of slow moving and not things that require immediate responses, but they definitely require starting to prepare with a seriousness, with a not messing around, but at the same time, it's not that we're going to be hit with something tomorrow.
Yeah.
But we can see that a lot of major threats are building up and getting worse. So it's really a matter of really understand it, really understand what are you actually scared of? What are the real threats? And sort of concurrently trying to figure out, how do I prepare for it? Are there skills I need to develop? Are there actions I need to take? Are there, what can I do that's within my abilities now and over time so that I can respond to it? But really recognize that the fear signals that we're getting are really, really relevant, even if they are shaped by historical fears or historical experiences. If we can understand that, it actually can give us a lot more context as to why we're fearful and also potentially of what we can do about it. Yeah. So it really is just accept it and work with it, as opposed to trying to get rid of it or trying to ignore it in some way. Yeah. What about you?
Before I go into mine, there were just two more bits I wanted to add, because I know where you've helped me loads is when you've talked about how do you create your own sense of safety. And this relates to the vagus nerve, when you talk about the vagus nerve and you talk about how that's a superhighway of information and how we can work with the different, you'll talk more eloquently about this, with the different kind of like the brain, the heart brain, the gut brain. But I like it when, and maybe, I know you haven't mentioned this yet, but maybe talk about the safety that we can create for ourselves. And you've talked about it before from that entrepreneurial perspective of the testing and the reinventing. But there's something that I think that's quite relevant for here as well, because safety definitely plays into it, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I can talk about it in the entrepreneurial way just really quickly. And I think this is probably something that we want to explore more deeply in a future podcast.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a conversation that's really worth having. But we can talk about it in the entrepreneurial way of explore, like really understand what's happening around you, experiment based on what you're noticing that's happening around you, where are some opportunities, and then test, figure out which ones kind of work, and start with low risk ones. And then based on what you're learning, whether it's learning this is moving me in the direction I want or it's not, and therefore what am I misunderstanding? How do I go back to explore and do it again and really understand it? Or another way that I talk about this is the palliative, the healing, or the strategic, or we can say current, past, future, which is what am I feeling in the moment and how do I take care of myself in the moment? How do I, do I need to react, or do I need to take care of myself and really sort of work with my nervous system? Then we have to look at the historical stuff. What's influencing how we're responding in the moment based on our histories, and also the future looking. Again, this is the strategic piece of how do I what do I need to do to move myself in a direction of increasing safety, which is basically survival, and how do I set myself up for thriving as much as possible as well.
Yeah.
And one piece that I've said to you a few times is letting things wash over you. If you have the time, like just allow yourself to just sit and observe. Because what happens a lot of times if we're in some sort of an overwhelm of any type, good or bad, we lose our ability to sense. We lose our ability to really notice things. And the noticing is really, that's what entrepreneurs have an analytical, successful entrepreneurs have much better analytical capacities, but they also have a profoundly better sense of awareness, of noticing things. Yeah. So when I say just sort of allow yourself to have these things wash over you, again, assuming that you don't need to run and save yourself if you have the time, and just allow yourself to notice, including your reactions to things, what's happening outside of you, what's the information that's available to you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, to just sum up where I think that we can look at fear through the lens as a helpful piece of information. And firstly, it's about understanding our own nervous system response. What's our typical go-to? And that might look different in different situations. Like I said, I feel like my main one is the fight, but in the work situation where I feel that I'm constrained because of finances, then then I know I can tip into the fawn response, which then leads me to freeze. So understanding that for yourself, I think is really, really helpful, because when that happens, you're hijacked. And if you know your natural hijack response, then you've got a better chance of bringing yourself back to a regulated state. So the next thing then is about just working with it. So once you've got that intelligence, how do you work with it, not against it? Then how can you create conditions that feel safe? And I know you talk about that from that individual perspective, from that entrepreneurial mindset. For me, it feels like, what are those safe pair of hands that you have when I talk about relational leadership? We've got this safe pair of hands, and who's in your environment that's that safe pair of hands. So besides cultivating it yourself, also think about your environment, whether that's your immediate family environment, your partner, your community. But what can you set up around you that helps to make you feel safe? And that's really important. A great quote that was said to me and my husband and our kids before we took a year out and went traveling and literally stepped into utter chaos. And we made the decision to do it. We sold all our stuff, put our stuff into storage, and got in the car and drove to Europe. And he just said, and also I'll add, he was dying of cancer at that time. So he only had a few months left to live. So we had this wise counsel conversation with him, and he just said, feel the fear and do it anyway. So whenever my husband and I come down to something feeling very fearful, we always come back to Simon said, feel the fear and do it anyway. And that helps to kind of keep us focused, because life is always calling us forward. Life does not, fearlessness does not exist. It's a part of life, and there's no going back. So we have no choice but to embrace. Well, we do have a choice, but I would say, because we're always moving forward, we should embrace the fear and still do it anyway. And we'll be surprised as to what we can achieve. Whereas the other choice is to not embrace it, and then you're just stuck fearful. And that's not really a life, not a life worth living, but it's not a life that's well lived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my take on it.
So it's about surviving and thriving, a life well lived. That's a great way to end there. So
yeah.
Great conversation, Liza. I really appreciate chatting with you again.
Yeah, me too, Kat. It's been great.
And what we're going to do is post our contact information down at the bottom. If people enjoy these conversations and are curious about other topics that they'd like us to, dear listener, if you would like to let us know in the comments what you'd like us to talk about, or if you've got questions or comments, we would welcome them. It's always interesting to hear what other people are thinking about and what they resonate with. So thank you very much for joining us today.